The pressure of 1,000 atmospheres was nothing compared to the weight of one lie. Kaelen Voss felt both. The former was a physical constant, a god of the deep, a titanic and impartial hand, squeezing the titanium alloy shell of his salvage submersible. The angler. It hummed through the deck plating, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up through the soles of his boots and settled in his bones. It was a language he understood, the honest physics of a hostile world. The lie was worse. It was the whisper of the hegemony, broadcast even here, 3,000 meters below the Pacific's sun-starved surface. Contribute. Ascend. Thrive. A promise of Martian terraformed gardens for those who fed the machine dutifully. A siren song of red soil and breathable air that smelled of anything other than recycled nutrients and ozone. Down here, in the crushing, silent dark, that promise felt thin as a soap bubble. The only light was the angler's own, 2 brilliant white cones that cut through the perpetual midnight, illuminating a graveyard. Before him, canted at a drunken angle on a field of abyssal silt, lay the prize, the skeletal remains of the CNS Retribution, a pre-hegemony chemical slug cruiser, a relic from the Unification Wars, an age when nations, not a monolithic corporate state, had sent men to kill each other. Its hull was a lattice of rust and strange bioluminescent corals that pulsed with a faint, ghostly blue light. It looked like a fallen cathedral. Kael's hands moved with an economy born of 10,000 hours in this chair. His cockpit was a cramped sphere of flickering redouts and scarred metal, the air thick with the metallic tang of the oxygen scrubbers and the faint, bitter scent of his own sweat. Through the thick Plaz steel viewport, the Retribution was a mountain of potential. Specifically, the thorium plate armor around its reactor housing. Pre-hegemony alloys were dense, pure, and worth a fortune in contribution credits. Enough to clear his debts. Enough to get him a cycle ahead, maybe even replace the failing components in the angler's life support, the ones he'd been patching with sealant and prayer for months. His fingers danced over the control grips, a pair of articulated joysticks that translated his movements to the massive manipulator arms outside. On the main screen, a holographic overlay detailed the stress points on the wreck. Red for critical, yellow for caution. He was a surgeon, and his patient was a 200,000-ton corpse. Easy now, he thought. The words a silent mantra against the deep-seated hum of the submersible. He guided the portside claw, a colossal pincer of hardened durasteel, toward a pre-scored section of the cruiser's hull. The claw's joints groaned in protest, the hydraulics whining a high, thin song of strain. Hegemony-grade parts. Shoddy. Rated for 2,000 meters, maybe, on a good day. He was pushing them, and the entire vessel, far beyond their intended limits. The hegemony built its tools like it built its citizens, just strong enough to do the job, but not strong enough to last. It encouraged dependency. It guaranteed the cycle. The claw bit into the ancient metal. A shudder ran through the angler, a violent tremor that rattled his teeth. The external microphones picked up the sound of screaming, tearing steel, a sound like the planet itself cracking a knuckle. It was a good sound, a sound of progress, a sound of credits flowing his way. His HUD glowed with fresh data. Torque levels were spiking. Hull integrity of the target section was degrading as planned. He eased back on the power, letting the immense pressure of the abyss do half the work, finding the sweet spot between brute force and finesse. This was the art of it, the thing they couldn't quantify in his performance reviews. The instinct. It was all he had left from his time in the fleet before the disgrace. Before the truth he'd seen was rebranded as insubordination. He'd once commanded a vessel with a crew of 30, charting courses through asteroid fields. Now, he commanded 2 robotic arms, picking through the bones of the past. It was a fall from grace, so complete, it was almost comical. A low groan echoed through the angler, deeper and more resonant than the tearing of the Retribution's hull. It wasn't an external sound. It was internal, the sub's own voice. Kael's eyes flicked from the salvage operation to the integrity sensors on the upper right of his console. All green. Nominal pressure. No micro-fracture warnings. Still, his stomach tightened. The sound was wrong. It was the sound of stressed metal reaching its plastic limit, the point just before catastrophic failure. He knew that sound intimately. He'd heard it once before, over the comms, from the engineering bay of the Orion. The memory was a scar, white and puckered, on the surface of his mind. He ignored it. He had to. This was his last chance. The debt collectors at the contribution office had made that abundantly clear. One more failed cycle, and his standard rights would be suspended. He'd be uncycled. A ghost in the machine with no access to housing, food, or medical. A non-person. The salvage was everything. He nudged the throttle for the starboard arm, bringing the plasma cutter online. A brilliant, silent lance of blue-white energy erupted from the tool's emitter, striking the Retribution's hull. The water around it instantly superheated, flashing into a cloud of vapor that was immediately crushed back into liquid by the ambient pressure. The only sign of the immense energy he was wielding was the angry, incandescent red line he drew across the thorium plate. Another groan from the angler. Louder this time. A deep, guttural complaint that vibrated through his chair and into his spine. This time, he didn't just glance at the sensors. He ran a full diagnostic. The onboard AI, a clipped and dispassionate voice he'd never bothered to name, chimed in his ear. All systems operating within acceptable parameters. Hull integrity at 99.8%. A lie. The AI was a hegemony product, too. It was programmed with optimism. It would tell you everything was fine, right up until the point the ocean came flooding in to prove it wrong. Kael trusted his gut more than the code. He pulled the plasma cutter back, the beam extinguishing with a soft hiss. The silence that followed was heavy, profound. There was only the thrum of the life support and the faint, almost subliminal crackle of his own nervous system. He zoomed the external camera in panning it away from the wreck and across the angler's own bow. The black, non-reflective plating was meant to absorb sonar, a relic of his sub's repurposed military design. It was also meant to be seamless. It wasn't. Just forward of the primary viewport, near the socket of the port manipulator arm, was a faint, almost invisible line, a seam. It was rippling like a heat haze off asphalt. A stress fracture. The immense pressure was compressing a flaw in the alloy. A microscopic bubble of impurity left over from a rushed, low-cost manufacturing process. A fault in the steel. The pressure of 1,000 atmospheres. The weight of 1,000 little shortcuts. 1,000 shaved credits. 1,000 officials who signed off on substandard materials to meet a quota. All of it bearing down on this one single point. On him. Time seemed to slow down, stretching like heated plastic. Every sound became distinct, magnified. The gentle tick-tick-tick of the chronometer on his display. The whisper of the ventilation fans. The frantic, hammering drumbeat of his own heart against his ribs. A bead of sweat traced a path from his temple down his jaw. He watched the seam, mesmerized by the quiet, inexorable physics of his own doom. He could feel the water molecules on the other side. A trillion tiny fists pounding on the door, searching for a way in. The groan came again, but now it had a new texture. A high, sharp, crystalline shriek was woven through it. The sound of something breaking on a molecular level. The seam gave. It wasn't an explosion. It was a release. A spiderweb of incandescent white lines erupted from the fault, branching out across the viewport in a fraction of a second. They weren't cracks in the plasteel itself. Not yet. They were stress patterns, the crystalline structure of the transparent armor failing. A snowflake of imminent death blooming before his eyes. An alarm finally shrieked, a useless, belated scream of electronic panic. The calm, dispassionate voice of the AI was gone, replaced by a panicked, synthesized shriek. Then came the noise. A hiss. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the blare of the alarm, through the pounding in his ears. It was the sound of the abyss, a high-pressure needle of water punching through a pinprick hole in the fracturing alloy seam. The jet was no thicker than a wire, but it hit the opposite bulkhead with the force of a solid projectile. A plume of supercompressed vapor exploded into the cockpit, instantly dropping the ambient temperature by 20 degrees. The air filled with a dense, freezing fog. The smell of the deep ocean salt, brine, and something ancient and cold filled his lungs. It was the smell of a tomb, his training buried under years of bitterness and civilian drudgery roared to the surface. It was a cold, clean fire in his veins, burning away the panic. Isolate breach. Jettison, wait. Emergency ascent. The words weren't thoughts, they were scripture. The holy trinity of survival. He slammed a gloved hand onto a covered red panel. The cover flipped up. Isolate, breach. A futile gesture. The breach wasn't a pipe he could seal. It was the very skin of his world tearing open. The hissing grew louder, deeper. The pinprick hole was widening. The single jet of water became a dozen, 100. A high-pressure spray that ricocheted around the tiny cabin. One of the streams struck a power conduit above his head. Sparks flew in a shower of brilliant orange, and the main lights flickered and died. He was plunged into a nightmare of red emergency lighting and strobing warning alerts. The water was everywhere now, a frigid mist that soaked through his jumpsuit in an instant, chilling him to the bone. Jettison, wait. His eyes were locked on the salvage. The massive plate of thorium armor, still held firmly in the port claw, was his ticket out of this life. It was his future. But right now, it was an anchor, dragging him down into the grave. The hydraulics of the manipulator arm were an integral part of the bow's structure. The growing fracture was centered right on the arm's main joint. The strain of the salvage was literally tearing his submersible apart. The choice was so stark, so brutally simple, it was almost laughable. Let go of the salvage and lose everything. Or hold on and die. Some choice. It was the hegemony's philosophy, distilled to a single, perfect moment. The shriek of stressed metal rose in pitch until it was a physical pain in his ears. The viewport, which had held against the pressure for 1,000 dives, began to visibly bow inward. The plas steel moaned. He could see the abyss pushing, a patient monster that had all the time in the world. He didn't. His hand shot out, slapping the emergency release for the manipulator claws. He didn't just release the thorium plate. He triggered the explosive bolts that severed the entire arms from the chassis. It was a protocol for entanglement, a last-ditch effort to free the sub. He was amputating his livelihood to save his life. There was a deafening bang that was felt more than heard, a concussive force that slammed him back into his seat. Outside the viewport, the two massive arms, one still clutching his fortune, were blasted away from the angler. They tumbled slowly, gracefully, into the crushing darkness, disappearing from the beams of his dying lights. Gone, the relief on the hull was instantaneous. The horrific groaning stopped. But the angler was now mortally wounded and thousands of tons lighter. It bucked like a spooked animal, its nose pitching upward violently. Emergency ascent. He grabbed the thruster controls, fighting to stabilize the vessel. The sub was out of control, a bubble of compromised air in a world of water, rocketing toward the surface. The ascent was too fast, far too fast. The rapid change in pressure would be almost as dangerous as the breach. If the remaining flaws in the hull didn't kill him, the bends would. Red warnings flashed across his screen in a frantic, unreadable blur. He was a passenger now. The G-forces pressed him deep into his chair. making his limbs feel like lead. His vision tunneled outside the viewport. The bioluminescent life of the abyssal plane streaked past, blue and green trails of light in the inky black. He was shooting upward through a reverse starfield. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He had just jettisoned the only thing that could have saved him from the slow death of the UN cycle. All to escape the immediate, crushing finality of the deep. He had traded one form of oblivion for another. The internal pressure in the cabin was dropping fast from the leak, while the external pressure was decreasing with the ascent. For a terrifying, beautiful moment, the two forces neared equilibrium. The hissing from the breach subsided. The water stopped spraying. A fragile piece settled in the wounded cockpit, broken only by the whine of overworked thrusters and the frantic, useless blaring of the alarms. Kael leaned his head back against the cold headrest, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He watched the depth gauge on his console unwind at a dizzying speed. 2,500 meters. 2,000. 1,500. He was rising. A bubble of stolen air, rocketing toward the sunlit prison of the surface. He had won. He had survived. And he had never felt so utterly, completely lost.